Thanks for inviting me to speak. About 3 years ago in New York City, a man named Wesley Aubrey was standing on a subway platform, and the man next to him had an epileptic seizure and fell onto the tracks, and a train was coming. Wesley Aubrey jumped onto the tracks, saved the man's life. It was a close call, even to the point where the lubricating oil of one of the subway cars was found in Wesley Aubrey's hair as he held the other man down, so the other man would not die. So why did he do this? They weren't related. There's no kinship question here. They weren't even from the same racial background. And even more striking, Wesley Aubrey had left his young son amongst other adults on the platform. The question is, why did he do it? By way of explaining his act, I'm going to propose that there's an ethical universal, which is a natural scientific phenomenon. And I'm going to propose that human behaviors obeying this ethical universal can be explained by neuroscientists. And in the next 20 minutes or so, I'll put forth a parsimonious neuroscientific theory to do so. Here's the story. One evening in a college library, I ran out of my scientific reading. I'm a neurobiologist. And I wandered into the comparative religion section, which in this particular library was very good. And after doing a lot of reading, I found out that across continents and across centuries, I could not find a religion that failed to have a statement of what we sometimes call the golden rule. So if you look, I'm not going to read all of these out, but if you look at the top one, you have Confucius. If you look at the blue one in the middle, a Christian statement. This red one here is a Muslim statement. And it does not take a religious perspective in order to come up with this principle of behavior, because here with the categorical imperative, Immanuel Kant says precisely the same thing. I was given further encouragement by going back and reading a paper by Axelrod and Hamilton, William D. Hamilton, the famous biologist, who showed that even computers can be programmed to exhibit reciprocity in their behaviors. There's nothing magical about the mechanisms that I'm going to be proposing in this lecture, or indeed in that book. And what Axelrod and Hamilton had done was to arrange for a computer tournament centered on the game Prisoner's Dilemma. And for those of you who don't remember what Prisoner's Dilemma is, Prisoner A and Prisoner B have committed a crime. They're both in jail, and the authorities are trying to get them to tell on each other, to defect. And what's a prisoner to do? Well, it turned out that the most clever computer programmers came up with a very simple program, which they called an evolutionary stable strategy. Prisoner A goes first. Now, the way the payoff matrix is set up is that if he rats on prisoner B, he gets the best payoff. He gets out of jail right away. But he doesn't know what prisoner B is going to do. If prisoner B also is defecting in another room, then the payoff is less. The evolutionary stable strategy followed by these computer programs was two simple lines of computer code. The first is that on A's first move, he should not defect. He should cooperate with prisoner B. And on all subsequent moves, he should do whatever prisoner B did on the previous move. That strategy, that two-line computer program, yields reciprocal altruism. Now, if all the religions I could find had a statement of the golden rule, and if even computers can be programmed, I'm encouraged I'm encouraged to think of it as a neuroscientific emanation, something that I, as a neuroscientist, theoretically can explain. And so the purpose of this talk will be to put forth a parsimonious scientific theory of how we manage to behave according to the golden rule. And then it would be ludicrous for me to ignore the dark side. And so at the end of the talk, I'll be envisioning a balance between central nervous system mechanisms for altruism on the one hand and those for aggressive or other violent behaviors on the other. I'm going to explain how behaviors that obey this ethical universal work, when indeed people do behave that way. And the theory comes in 4 easily realizable steps. Step 1 is to represent one's impending action to oneself. That sounds vaguely mystical, but in fact it's been part of working neuroscience for almost 60 years. It's called reafference theory, after a German physiologist. And so what you should do is think of yourself as looking at a scene and then moving your eyeball to the right. And my question for you is, when you move your eyeball to the right, does the world appear to be moving to the left? And the answer is no, because in the brain, the oculomotor system has sent a command signal called a corollary discharge back to the visual system in order to tell the visual system that the world is about to move and to expect it to move in the predicted way, and that's what accounts for the stability of your visual field. The great neuroscientist Antonio Damasio has extended that to all other movements of the body, and in this theory I'm simply extending it to social acts, to represent one's social act, an act towards another human being, to yourself. That's step one. That's easy. Step two, neuroscience is coming along fast. If you look at the work of Charles Gross at Princeton University, or the work of Nancy Kanwisher, who's a professor at MIT, it's obvious that we have neurons in the inferotemporal lobes of our cerebral cortex that respond specifically to faces. And we can obviously code all other aspects of a person's visual or auditory appearance. Now, at this point, we have to bring in valence. For an act to have ethical impact, it has to have, for an act to have ethical meaning, it has to have some impact on someone else. That impact could be negative or it could be positive. And I'm going to start out by talking about negative acts that could make another person afraid. So, do neuroscientists have a handle on this? The negative form of the golden rule would say you should not do unto others as you do not want them to do unto you, the kinds of acts that would make somebody else afraid. What do we know about the neuronal mechanisms that govern fear? Because at the time that we're envisioning the other person, the target of our act, we're also going to be thinking about the consequences of the act. With respect to negative consequences, I'll summarize in one slide a stick figure that you can read in full about by reading the book, for example, of Joseph Ledoux, who's a professor at NYU. We know a lot about the neural circuitry underlying fear. And the simple one-slide version of it is that any signals which might be frightening, be they auditory, visual, tactile, or whatever, are going to be processed in a region of the forebrain called the thalamus. Visual in the lateral geniculate nucleus, auditory in the medial geniculate nucleus, and so forth and so forth. And from the thalamus, there's going to be two ways of sensory information reaching the amygdala. The direct way, straight from thalamus to amygdala, the amygdala being part of the phylogenetically ancient forebrain just beneath our ears. The indirect way would bring the signals to the cerebral cortex, the neocortex, the recently evolved cortex, and from the cortex over to the amygdala. The reason that I'm emphasizing the amygdala, this group of neurons in the basal forebrain, is that electrical signaling coming out of the central nucleus of the amygdala is necessary and sufficient for the feeling of fear in human beings, or for the expression of fear-laden behaviors in other animals. So at this point, we're afraid. Now comes the key step of the theory. It's the point that one has to understand. Step 3 of the theory is that we simply blur the target's image with our own image. And I talked about these ideas with Nancy Kanwisher at MIT. Blurring images, losing resolution, is the easiest thing an engineer or a neuroscientist can do. How could we do it? We could decrease the activity of inhibitory neurons. They're called GABA neurons in the cerebral cortex, thus adding noise to the signal, thus enabling the blurring of signal, one's own image with one's the target's image. There are things called gap junctions, which you read about every day in the newspaper is synaptic communication between neurons. But there's another way which is even faster and even more surefire. There's a protein expressed which makes a little hole, a gap, let's call it, in the nerve cell membrane. And if the neuron next door, if you look at my hands, similarly forms a gap, electrically charged ions can go directly from one nerve cell to the other, thus spreading excitation. It's the easiest possible way to spread excitation, thus to provide for cross-excitation and the blurring of images. Cholinergic inputs to the cerebral cortex are extremely powerful, and even small changes in the deposition of the neurotransmitter acetylcholine will make huge differences in cortical excitability. We can also alter the timing of inputs slightly. So if you think about it as a rhetorical question, if the nervous system does computations and you think of it as our biological computer, is it easier to make a computer work better in your home study, or is it easier to make it work worse? Well, I think the answer is obvious. It's easier to make it work worse, and that's all my theory asks us to do. Step 4 is equally simple. If, when you envision the consequences of the act, if it's good for you, then it's all right to do to the other person. But the example that I've given first is if it's bad for you, if it would make you afraid or injured even, then you should not do it to the other person. The theory is parsimonious. Scientists hate to make self-serving extra assumptions. The fewer assumptions you can make and still explain the data that you want to explain, in my case, ethical behaviors when they occur, the better off you are. So, we note that no special abilities are presupposed. There's no deus ex machina in this field. We're not supposing special facilities in the brain. Secondly, as I just said, is it easier to make a mechanism work? It is easier to make a mechanism work lousily, I guess is what I should say, than to make it work better. There are many, many ways to throw off cortical perceptual function. And by the way, all of those 3 mechanisms that I proposed, and there could be other mechanisms proposed as well, could work in parallel. They all could work, and they could even have different importances in different individuals. So we think that the theory is quite parsimonious. By the way, so far, I've talked about the negative acts that would make a person afraid. What about this positive statement of the golden rule? You should love one another even as you love yourself. Well, we know one heck of a lot about effects of hormones on the brain, animal brain and human brain, which underlie sex behavior. And people like Barry Cavern, who's a professor at University of Cambridge in England, or Michael Newman, who's a professor of biology at Boston College, know a lot about the hormonal and the genetic and the neural foundations of parental behaviors. Maternal behaviors, yes, in animals, but also parental behaviors. And Professor Cavern and I think that these primitive, pro-social, hormone-laden behaviors actually provide the Bauplan, the structural principle for a wide variety of affiliative behaviors by which we behave in a friendly way towards other individuals. So in terms of the emotional consequences of ethical acts that are going to have an impact on someone else, we really know about the emotional mechanisms that underlie either the negative side, the fear, or the positive side, the love towards other individuals. At this point, it would be ludicrous of me to talk about our human brains being, quotes, wired for reciprocity, close quotes, if I didn't also consider the potential for aggression and violence. After all, we had a moment of silence this morning at September 11th, and since the Holocaust, there have been at least 5 attempts at genocide. You can count them up there, I won't read them. And so if that's organized violence, one nation versus another, one people versus another, we also have to deal with what I have to unfortunately call ordinary, individual criminal violence. With respect to the neurobiology of aggression, performed by animals, usually male animals, for good biological reasons, we understand quite a lot. We know that there's intermale competition for food and mates and territory. If you're a bird and you need shoreline in order to have access to the water, you'll fight for it. If you're a male bird, you'll fight for it. If you're an elk, you have to maintain your territory as a male or you can't mate. Among humans, across the findings in many, many nations, the lifetime curve of murders as a function of going from birth time to, let's say, dying at the age of 80, follows the curve very closely, the curve of testosterone levels in the blood, going up suddenly at the beginning of puberty and then declining slowly as testosterone declines. Masters and Wilson at University of Western Ontario demonstrated that. And we know how that works. With respect to individual aggression for what I'll call reasonable biological purposes, getting food, getting mates, testosterone turns on genes in the amygdala, especially a gene of a small fragment of a protein called vasopressin. It turns on genes in the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis, sorry for the neuroanatomical terminology, again, increasing electrical activity in those 2 groups of nerve cells in the forebrain, and testosterone inhibits electrical activity in the septum, and by the way, the septum inhibits aggressive behaviors. So the simplest way of envisioning for you in one slide how testosterone fuels biologically motivated individual aggression is that it heightens activity in at least 2 cell groups that foster aggressive behavior, and it inhibits electrical activity in a cell group that inhibits aggressive behavior. That's very clear. But as we move from individual aggression for normal biological purpose to organized social violence, neuroscientists do not have a clue. And when I wrote that book, I mainly read Barbara Tuchman. Donald Kagan has written a wonderful book about the historical view of 4 famous wars. And Barbara Ehrenreich had a somewhat kooky theory, but she's a very good writer, about the historical causation of war within the past 4 or 5 years. Doubling back for a minute, with respect to individual violence, all is not lost. My colleagues, James Gilligan, who was a professor at Harvard and the chief psychiatrist of the Massachusetts prison system, and James Devine and I, working for the New York Academy of Sciences, and it came out as volume 1036, thought that we should mainly be treating pre-adolescent boys as being the kids at risk, and saying, how do you prevent the development of, for example, gang membership and subsequent violence in adolescent boys. And following James Gilligan's book, which was published by Thames and Hudson, we talked about primary strategies, secondary strategies, tertiary strategies. Primary strategies being those strategies which should be applied to the entire population. Excellent neonatal care, small schools to avoid anonymity, good nutrition, the avoidance of humiliating those young kids, especially if they don't have very good socioeconomic status. Secondary measures are those for those guys who are already at risk. There could be pharmacogenomics, there's the necessity to avoid alcohol, etc. And tertiary strategies would be for those people who have already been violent. Then we're going to be talking about pharmacology, but it's important to obey behaviorist principles and avoid punitive measures and negative reinforcement. But you can read all about it in volume 1036 of the New York Academy of Sciences Annals. And that's with respect to individual violence. Remember, with organized violence, neuroscientists are out of it. Instead, what we can talk about is to seek a balance among traits, a balance among genetic influences on pro-social or friendly behaviors and antisocial traits or aggressive behaviors. And we also, at the same time, want to envision interactions between genetic and environmental influences. In the more simple-minded newspaper articles, you read about a gene for this and a gene for that. You don't know whether to file it under fiction or nonfiction. You also know, just as adult humans who've lived in this marvelous city, about environmental influences, especially at the neonatal period and during adolescence. And what a neuroscientist can tell you, circa 2009, would be the following. That clearly there are some genes which dispose us toward friendly pro-social actions. And there are other genes whose products would dispose us toward aggressive actions. Now, a guy with these kinds of genes, I'll picture it from the point of view of a male because they initiate the larger number of aggressive acts, or at least they used to. This fellow may have an excellent genetic heritage, and he may grow up in a very permissive environment, and he is probably going to run for Senate. On the other hand, you can have people that start out with an optimistic genetic heritage. I'm not talking about one gene. I'm talking about patterns of genes numbering in the thousands. But if he's put in the wrong environment, he could be disposed toward antisocial activity. I once moved into an area around New York where the brightest boys turned out to be the cleverest criminals. And so, of course, we moved. But those guys were an illustration of that. On the other hand, you could have very aggressive young people. We usually talk about genes having to do with the disposition of the neurotransmitter serotonin in the brain, which I won't go into details. But you could have fellows who, especially through an absence of serotonin signaling, might be disposed toward antisocial activities, but on the other hand, given the right environment, they could turn out to be our very best leaders. So we're talking definitely about genetic influences on behavior, but you also have to talk about environmental influences, especially prenatal, neonatal, and adolescent. Implications for our meeting today. Actions by individuals for the discussion period or question period. How do we talk about the differences between, for example, normal aggression, I've used that phrase a couple of times, and abnormal aggression? How do we discuss that? More importantly for the neuroscientist is the area where we're ignorant, communal actions by social groups. Can we, for example, look for examples of feed-forward phenomena, psychosocial phenomena, or positive feedback in which a cause yields an amplification of itself, by which a neuroscientist could begin to understand how individual tendencies toward violence, when these people are put in groups, turn into socially organized violence of the sort that we deplore. Summarizing the talk, human behavior that obeys an ethical universal, let's call it the golden rule, can be explained by a neuroscientific theory that does not presuppose any unusual central nervous system capacities. Regarding negative and valenced acts, the impacts that make an act important towards another person, we know a lot about the mechanisms controlling fear on the negative side, or sex and maternal behaviors on the positive side. And we're looking for opportunities to generalize those areas of knowledge that we have toward a wider area of life. What about antisocial behavior? We do understand testosterone-triggered mechanisms in neuroscientific detail, but we've not comprehended at all socially organized violence. And finally, gene-environment interactions produce balances among pro- and antisocial behavioral tendencies. All of the slides were made by my assistant, Susan Strider, and during the question and answer, I'll look forward to questions. Thank you.